This film is probably the only one ever made at Magnet, which was a small mining community near Waratah in northwest Tasmania. Magnet centred around a silver mine which started operations in 1894 and finally petered out in 1940. My interest was in following Victoria's first significant hydroelectric scheme, which powered a gold mine at Cassilis in northeastern Victoria from 1908 to 1916. The Cassilis mine then closed, the plant was all sold, and the hydro plant, the turbine, generator and pipeline, was purchased by the Magnet Silver Mining Company. They transported it across to Tasmania and set it up at Magnet in 1918. And it ran there until that mine finally closed in 1940. As part of following the history of the plant, I put a request in Kerry Pink's column in the Advocate newspaper in Burnie for any photos or information about the running of the hydro plant in Magnet. One of the 4 replies was from a Mrs. Grace Hales, and she said that she and her husband, R.C. Hales, Ruby Clarence Hales, had operated one of the stores, one of the 2 stores in Magnet, and that he had taken movie film of Magnet. She said the film was in the custody of her son, Kelvin Hales, so I contacted Kelvin. He said yes, he did have it somewhere, but he hadn't seen it for quite a while. Well, 14 years later, the film turned up and Kelvin loaned it to me for copying. It had been taken on a 16mm Kodak camera. It had suffered quite a lot of sprocket damage and quite a few pieces had been cut out, but nevertheless I was able to make a videotape copy of it. I returned the original to Kelvin and a videotape and asked him to record a commentary as to what the scenes were, since the film was silent. Kelvin did this, and it is his commentary that you will hear on this disc. He also said he was quite happy for any people to copy the film. It may be of interest to researchers or perhaps provide some nostalgic memories for people who lived at Magnet or Waratah in those days. His only request was that its origin be acknowledged as having been taken by Mr. R.C. Hales at Magnet in the early 1930s. It gives a very clear picture of the sort of life people had in these remote mining communities. It certainly wasn't easy. A life wonderfully described in Marjorie Godfrey's book on Waratah, which contains a chapter on Magnet. I hope you enjoy it.
The silver-lead mining town of Magnet was situated in the Magnet Valley, about 8 kilometres west of Mount Bischoff. 2 ladies walking down the 2-foot gauge railway line towards the shops, of which there were only 2 at that particular time. Mr. Hales had the one on the right hand side of the screen with the house behind, and Mr. Shady operated the one on the left hand side. The Shadys had shops in both Waratah and Magnet. The houses were mainly set on the hills on each side of the valley, going from the mine down right towards the school. And Kelvin Hales feeding the fowls in the backyard. The only means of transport to Waratah was via the 2-foot gauge railway. It was about 16 kilometres in length, and after crossing the Arthur River, wound its way up the big hill through many cuttings to the Emu Bay Railway siding just out of Waratah. This part of the line went up to the mouth of the tunnel, and Mr. Ferg Johnson lived in the house that was built right up on the bank on the right hand side there. There's another blank. There's no flaming good. One of the mallet tank engines on its way past the shops and on to Waratah. Mr. Sam Smith was the driver in those days. The Magnet Primary School, Mr. Cherry was the teacher, and Mount Bischoff is there in the background. The boys playing cricket in the playground. The girls working in the gardens along the side of the school, and the headmaster's residence, which was attached to the school. The little girl standing out there on her own with the 2 plats is Rosie Witterson. Mr. Hales cutting wood in the backyard. Looking towards the loco shed from near the main mine office. And Mr. Rubnan Caro pushing one of the empty ore trucks back to the tunnel. A truck of ore being brought from the tunnel to the crusher. the hydro station, the magnet rail motor, a T-model Ford that was adapted for use on the railway, and this little T-model did sterling service between the two townships of Magnet and Waratah. Mr. Bob Hales, the mine manager, walking towards the main office. One of the mallet locomotives can be seen in the background in the loco shed. And Mr. Hale standing outside the mine office. There were a number of walking tracks on the hills surrounding Magnet, and Mrs. Hales and Kelvin and Bryn Johnson are on this one up on Dogs Hill. Mrs. Hales came from Cambridgeshire in England, where for miles upon mile it was absolutely dead flat, and she came from there to Magnet, which was nothing but hills and valleys. Margaret Egan and Kelvin Hales on one of the walking tracks. Margaret's mother and father were Gladys and Frank Egan, and Frank later had the butcher's shop in at Waratah for many years. The headmaster from the Waratah State School, leaving to go to Burnie on the occasion of a visit by a battleship from the Royal Australian Navy. They're tied up at Ocean Wharf. The sailors marched through the main streets of Burnie, led by the band, and here they are just beginning to go up Marine Terrace from the wharf area. Coming along Wilmot Street towards Mount Street. the band, turning into Mount Street. The club hotel is there in the background. Mr. Hale's sister, Mrs. Von Bibra, on a visit to Magnet from the northwest coast. One of the locomotives bringing a load of wood up to the mine. A general view of the mine buildings, the tennis court in the front, the power station on the left hand side, the main processing plant in the middle, and on the right hand end, the white building, is the auxiliary steam power plant. This was used in times of water shortage to provide power for the mine. It was subsequently dismantled by Mr. Bilstein and was removed to the wharf area at Stanley, where it provided power for Gray's sawmill for many years, until finally a rock fall from the face of the nut demolished it. A general view of the mine layout, the power station in the foreground, the crusher up in the right hand side. The mouth of the tunnel was in the top left hand corner behind those buildings. Magnet under snow. The bank in front of Mr. Hales's house. Mrs. Hales, Myra Johnson and Kelvin having a snow fight near the end of the shop. Mr. Hales was born in Penguin on the northwest coast, and this is a shot of the main beach looking along towards where the surf club used to be. The Methodist Church at Penguin there in the background, and some of the ladies back at Magnet outside Mr. Hales's shop. On Melbourne Cup Day, Mr. Hales used to put the old Cossa wireless and speaker on the front veranda of the house, and the miners would gather on the bank below and listen to the running of the Melbourne Cup. Jacko, the Angora rabbit. The home of Mr. Charlie Fraser, the surface foreman at the mine, looking down towards the school and Waratah in the background on top of the far hill. Mr. Fraser, Mrs. Hales, Florrie Fraser and Brian Harrison. Brian was a little camera shy, but he was finally coaxed to come out, and here are Brian and Florrie walking down the path towards the railway line. The footbridge across the Arthur River was at the end of the long straight down below the school, just before the railway turned to the right to go along the bank of the river towards the foot of the big hill. It was a very picturesque walk through the area from the Arthur River to West Bischoff. It was mainly level going right through from Magnet through to the West Bischoff. But of course after arriving there was the big climb up the foothills of the mountain to the township of Waratah. Mr. Rowe, the butcher at Waratah at the time, had a large cage with several kookaburras. Just some general views of Waratah, Mount Bischoff. Mr. Whit Kelly had a horse and dray, and he did a lot of the carting in the area, and his stables are just there in the foreground. The tall chimneys here belong to the Bischoff Hotel. This is the main street of Waratah, followed by the War Memorial.